super data engineering project using the Marvel API? Follow me as I show you how to create a Marvel developer account, how to pull that Marvel data, and then how to create some cool visuals at the very end. So stick with me as we walk through a super data engineering project. I'm Chris Gamble. If you've not been here before, this is my channel, Gamble Data Engineering, where I cover the concepts, tutorials, and demos that help you become a data engineering master. Be sure to like and subscribe and follow me for more exciting projects. Let's get started with how do you create a developer account for the Marvel API. Let's go over to developer.marvel.com. Right in the center here, we'll click on Get Started. So you'll click on Sign In. It'll take you to a place to enter in your email address. You'll click on Continue. You'll enter in your personal information. So your first name, last name, choose a password, enter your birth date. Be sure to do those things. You get points. You could earn some free things later on to use those points on. Kind of neat if you like the Marvel Universe. Finish by clicking Agree and Continue. You'll go to your email and get the number that they provide. Be sure to look through the API terms of use. There is some important information in here if you are going to use the data in a public application that other people will be able to see. There's some guidelines that you have to follow in order to do that. So be sure that you do read the terms of use. If you're just using it for personal projects, not a big deal, but again, if you're going to use it to put on anything, to post to anything, be sure to read the terms of use. Once you finish, you'll get a public key and a private key. This will be your key to use. If you're going to use it in a website, be sure that you're adding your website information here as a refer to that API. At the very bottom, Marvel would like you to tell them what projects that you're using the data for. So be sure to fill that in. Once you do that, you take a look at the API. So there's some documentation in here. There's some interactive documentation in here once you have your API, which is really cool. A lot of APIs have this where it will give you a list of API calls that you could hit. So you could look through here. You could see that there's various character calls, comics, creators, events, so on, series, stories, so on and so forth. Feel free to look through here at your leisure. The one that we're going to look at today is characters. So we're going to click on that and expand it. And there's some things in here that we'll talk about as we go through. The big things that we're going to look at up front are the actual attributes of character that we're going to get back from the API. This is data that will be returned by the API. This specifically is the character data. This other data is really just metadata for the API call. We're going to use the ID field, the name field. This is the name of the character. The description, short bio, the thumbnail, we'll be using that later. ID, name, description, and thumbnail. So we see that the ID is an integer, int, name is a string, description is a string, and thumbnail says image, but it actually returns a URL to that thumbnail. Those are the fields that we're going to be using today. Now we have all the information that we need from the Marvel Developer Gateway. The next step is going to be to create a table in our database for our data to land in. So let's go over to Azure Data Studio where we're going to create a table. I have a line up here that says drop table if exists. So basically this is going to drop my existing table from where I was doing some testing, and then we're going to do a create table. So the create table, again, we're putting it into staging.characters. We have the name, the description, the resource URI, thumbnail, comics, and then the ID. We'll include the resource URI just in case we need it later at some point down the line for another project. The thumbnail will be important for today's project. Comics actually comes through as an integer. So let's change this. Okay, so we're going to create a table. We're going to include the name, which we're going to use varchar for the data type and 250 characters just to ensure that we have a large enough field there to hold any character names that come in. We have the description, and I'm using varchar max just because to make sure, again, that we have enough space in that field to hold that full description. The resource URI, just in case we need it at some point in the future, it'll be good to have. The URI is really just a URL. Again, using max just in case it is a long URL that comes through. The thumbnail, varchar max again, just in case it does happen to be a really long URL that comes through. Comics, we're going to do int for integer. This is because this is the number of comics that character shows up in. And then finally we have the ID, and that'll be important for any other API calls that we may call where we're needing to relate from a character ID, maybe in a comic API, back to this character table. We're going to run that script. You'll see that it completed successfully and executed in 1/100th of a second. So very quick, doesn't take long to create a table, and drop a table if it exists. Before we do take a look at the API, why don't you put down in the comments below, what's your favorite Marvel character, if you have one? Drop that down below. Also looking forward to the Wolverine Deadpool movie that's coming out on Thursday. All right, let's take a look at this Python script. These top handful of lines are called libraries that we have to import. When you're writing a Python script, there are some predefined libraries that are automatically in there. The first library that you have to import is called requests. If you are new to Python and you've not used it before, each of these, probably pyodbc and requests, you may have to install, which is separate than import. There's a process called pip install that you'd run in your command line. So for example, we'll pull up our command prompt and I'll show you. We could do pip install pyodbc, and it's going to come back and tell me that I've already have it installed and that the requirements are already met. If you don't have it already, then it will go out to PyPy, import the package, and install that package onto your machine so that you can do the import. And you'll do the same thing with the request library if you need to. To explain what each of these libraries do, requests is the library that pulls the API data. This datetime, from datetime, we're importing datetime. And that sounds silly, but in datetime, there are several functions. So from datetime, I'm going to import the class datetime, so that we're doing this because part of the API call for the Marvel API includes a timestamp that you have to pass into it. In order to get that timestamp, I need the datetime class so that I could use a call function within that class, so that I could use the now function within that class to get the current timestamp. We have the hash library. So again, because we have to pass in a hash of the public key, the timestamp, and the private API, and the private key, we need that hash library to transform that into a hash. We're going to import SSL. I'm importing SSL today because I have to create a TLS adapter, and I have to create that TLS adapter in order to set the encryption and the hash key for the communication with the API. Okay, and finally, pyodbc. So pyodbc connects to your database. You pass it in either the connection string or the DSN. DSN stands for data source name. And you pass in the DSN so that you can connect to your data warehouse. We have this next set of items are called variables. So these are the variables that I needed in order to run the script. We have a limit and an offset. We have a limit and an offset. We're going to reset that offset to 0. The limit is 25. The offset skips the first X number of rows, whatever that number is that you've passed in for the offset. The reason why we need it here is because we're going to loop through every 25 records, right? And so for every loop, we need to increment the offset by 25. And you'll see that happen as we go through our Python script. But right here, we're just initializing the variable. We have our public key and our private key that, again, we just got from the Marvel developer portal. And then we have the display, the attribution information that we need to display. And I just called it display NYT so that I remember to display it in my YouTube description when I post this video. I have a variable for the timestamp. Again, that's datetime.now, because now is the function for the datetime to get whatever the current date timestamp is at the moment that the API that the Python script runs. This next piece transforms that timestamp into a string. And so datetime.strftime, again, just transforms that timestamp into a string value so that we could combine it with the other pieces that need to be combined for the hash that we have to pass in for the API. Okay, next, this is the base API. So again, gateway.marvel.com/v1. Marvel is currently on version 1 of their API /public. We have my DSN name. This is unique to me. This is something that you'll change in your script. Followed by a connection string. So this is the connection string that I'll pass into the pyodbc module when we get to that point. You'll see that I've preceded my string with an F. When you precede your string with an F within Python, that enables you to pass in a variable into that string, and that makes the string more dynamic. And so in this case, I have DSN equals, and then whatever gets entered into the db DSN variable will pass into this string. So again, makes it a little bit more dynamic, especially if you have multiple places where you need to use things, or as you see later on, when you have to loop through things. This next part is a class. Next, we have the TLS adapter. This is a class. Basically, a class is a set of instructions that is used to create another object within your script. In this case, the object that we're creating is a TLS adapter. It is explicitly defining that we're using AES 128 and SHA-256 as our encryption and our hash method. This next part is a function that I created. So functions in Python are preceded with DEF. DEF stands for define. So that's a good way to remember it. So you're defining a function. So DEF space, whatever you want to call your function, any required variables that have to be passed into that function for the function to work. So in this case, this is creating a MD5 hash. So that's the hash library .md5 that creates the MD5 hash object. Next, MD5 hash .update the input string. We're pulling that input string from what's being passed into the function. .encode, and then UTF-8 is what we're encoding with. Next, we transform that into a hexadecimal representation of that string. And then we're going to return hash result. It's important that when you create the function, if you need to pass something back into your script, that you're returning whatever it is that you're going to pass. These next two lines are our connection and our cursor for our connection to our data warehouse. So again, we have pyodbc.connect and our connection string, which is being called from up above. Once we have that connection set, we can create a cursor. A cursor is what we're going to use further down in order to execute some SQL scripts that will be running within this Python. Cursor, we're going to use that connection that we just created and create a cursor object. Basically, the cursor right now is just an empty bucket waiting for instructions to be fed into it. Next, we're going to create a variable for the MD5 hash. So we're going to call the function that we created up above, pass in the timestamp, the string version of the timestamp, plus the self-private key, so the private key that we got from the Marvel portal, and then the public key, again, that we just got from the Marvel portal. So we're combining all that, passing it into the function. The function is going to output the hash version of that concatenated string that we're concatenating by purely using plus signs in between each of the variables. Next is the request API. So rec API is what I called that variable. Again, you'll see that the string is preceded with an F, and basically this is just the string of the API call that we're going to make. So you'll see we have the base API. We're calling our character we're calling the characters API call. TS is the variable for the timestamp. So TS equals, and then our string timestamp, which is our variable. So we're passing in string timestamp, which is our variable that we're creating within this Python script. The API key is required for us to pass through, so we pass through the Marvel public key. And then the hash, which is the vmd5 hash that we just created. Now we have the get data function that I created. In this In this function, we're requiring the API call that we're going to make, so the URL. We're going to pass in the limit and the offset. And you'll see that we're dynamically changing the offset down below during our while loop. We create a parameters variable, so we're just calling it params. Again, the request API is going to be the request API that we're passing into the function, and then we're going to add the limit and the offset query criteria for the API, because the limit and the limit won't change each time, but the offset will change with each cycle of the loop. Now, this next piece is important to understand. We're going to do a try and except. So this is basically if you've programmed another language. Other languages use try and catch. Python uses try and except. So try tries this piece of the code. So in this case, we're going to try to create a session. So request.session. Basically, this just opens a listener. We're going to use that session and we're going to mount the TLS adapter. It basically just saying, okay, this is criteria that we need to use for this session. We're going to create a response variable, which is going to be the session.get. Get is the type of API call that we're going to make. If you want to learn more about API calls, check out this link in the upper right. We did a video about it earlier, and it gives you some detailed information about what each of the different methods for an API call are. So again, we're going to pass in the request API URL that was created with this string. We're going to print out the response code. That way we know if it's 200, 409, whatever. We need to understand that it's a 200. If any part of that fails, and then finally, we're going to return the response.json, which is the JSON version of the response. Next piece, if any piece of this fails, then it's going to run this exception piece. So exception as E. E, in this case, E will be the variable for whatever exception. E is going to be the variable for whatever exception happens to come our way. We're going to print the exception, and we're going to return nothing because nothing was passed. So we're printing the exception and saying, hey, I don't have anything. Final mile here. So this is the loop. So while true, basically we're just saying while this if statement is true, then we're going to say data, get data, which again is the function that we have up here. Pass in the request API, the limit and the offset. Currently the offset's 0 and the limit's 25. If what's returned is none, there's nothing in this data results, then it's going to break and exit the loop. Otherwise, it's going to continue on with the instructions that we pass into it. So here we're going to define a variable called characters, and that characters is going to be defined as data, which is the variable that is holding the JSON that was passed in from the function. We want the part of the JSON that is under data and then under results. Then we have a nested loop here. So this is a while loop. So while everything's true, then it will continue with the loop. This is the next piece of the loop. This is a for loop. So for each character in characters is what this is saying. We're receiving that list of characters from the API. We want to loop through each one of those characters and output what that character is so that we could pass that into our database. So what this is going to do is for those 25 characters, it's going to get the character ID, the name, description, resource, URI, thumbnail, comics, and the thumbnail and comics. You'll see some additional pieces here. We'll walk through that. So we have the character ID, and basically ID is the name of the field in that list that I want to return and assign to the character ID. Next, we want the name. Same concept. Here, you see that we're using a replace function, and I had to do the replace function to get rid of this apostrophe. You can escape that apostrophe in another method. Just to keep things simple today, I just replace the apostrophe so that it gets rid of the apostrophes. The description, the same thing. Then we have the thumbnail. So the thumbnail, I'm concatenating the path of the thumbnail, so the URL, with the extension, and you'll see how we use that in a moment. Next, comics. This is going to be the number of comics that that character shows up in. And then here, we're creating a string, again, preceded with the F for reasons that we mentioned prior. And you see that we are concatenating all the variables that we just created above. And we're surrounding each one with apostrophes and then a comma in between each one so that we could pass that those variables into our next string, which is a SQL insert statement. Here we're printing the string value that we created of those variables that we just created. Here you see that we're passing in the value string that we just created, and then we're creating a SQL insert statement. Insert into staging.characters, and we have the list of fields from that table that we're going to be inserting data into, and then we're passing the values into that string within this values part of this SQL statement. Finally, we're going to try to execute the SQL statement. Again, it's cursor.execute. You'll remember from above where we created a cursor that's just sitting there waiting for our instructions. So finally, we're going to execute the SQL statement, and then we're going to commit. If any part of that fails, it will print the insert statement along with the error. Finally, it will print the offset, the current offset for this loop, and then it will offset, and then finally it will increment the offset by the limit. So first time the offset is 0, second time it'll be 25, next time it'll be 50, so on and so forth until it completes the API call and there are no other characters to retrieve from that is the Python script. So we could run it. When we hit run, in the upper right hand corner, the little play button, you'll see that we'll start the Python script. In about 30 seconds, it will start outputting some lines based on what we've scripted out here. You'll see that it will print out the list of value strings, it'll print out any exceptions that may occur, so on and so forth from all the things that we have listed above. But the Python API does take about 30 seconds to a minute before all of a sudden it will start outputting data. It's not the fastest API in the world, and it does take some time. So we'll come back here in a moment and skip ahead. Okay, we have some results here. You'll see, again, these are the things that are outputting as it goes through and starts pulling the API data. You'll see it finish the first set, and it'll continue to loop. See, there's our 200. And here's the next set, finish those 25. Here in a moment, it'll say 200 again, go to the next 25. Once the data comes into the Python script, the rest of it's pretty quick to process, but those API calls do take some time. So let's go to Azure Data Studio. So in Azure Data Studio, we're going to say select asterisk from staging customers. So this is the asterisk stands for all. This is going to pull all of the records from staging.characters. Hit run, and we'll see character names, descriptions, resource URIs, thumbnail, URLs, number of comics that character is in, and that character ID has been entered into our database from the Python script. So again, the Python script went out to the API, parsed that JSON data that was returned, and then pushed the records into our table in our database that we told it to. So super exciting. That is an ETL process. For those of you that this is your first ETL process, congratulations. You've completed your first ETL process. So super exciting with a pretty cool data set. So now that we have our data there, I'm going to show you how to connect to it from Power BI. There's some cool information in here. I'm going to show you how to make something pretty cool out of it. I've downloaded Power BI Desktop. If you don't have it, you could go out and get it. It's a free download from the Microsoft Store. We're going to create a blank report. Next, we're going to import data from SQL Server. We're going to connect to our database. We're going to pull our staging.characters. You'll see that we have our characters in there. We'll hit load, and that's how you connect. Once you're connected to your data set, you create something like this. Here we've searched for Spider-Man. I'm going to show you how to recreate this, including the images. Let's go to a new page, and we are going to just come over here to the right, expand our data set. We're going to click on the thumbnail, and you'll see the thumbnail pop up. We're going to click on name. It'll add the name. Click on description. You'll see the description. Then we're going to click on comics, and you will see the number of comics that each of those characters are in. In order to get this to appear as a thumbnail instead of just a URL, click on the thumbnail under column tools and data category. There will be a drop down, and you could choose image URL. If you choose web URL, it will appear as a web URL. By default, it will be text, but again, change it to image URL, and you'll see the image pop up there. So pretty cool. I was super excited that this was in there and I could show this to you today. The final thing I want to show you is I have this text search slicer, and what this does is we could create a slicer, and a slicer is really just a way to filter visuals. I'll add in the name to the slicer, and then we could type in whatever we want. So in honor of Deadpool and Wolverine coming out this week, let's put in Deadpool, and you'll see a list of Deadpool characters. So you see Deadpool, Rogue from Deadpool, specifically from Deadpool, Deadpool from X-Men Battle of the Atom, and then various other Deadpools, some Lego Deadpool, some Mr. Sinister, and Cable from Deadpool. So you'll see that Deadpool appeared in 945 comics. Again, in honor of Deadpool and Wolverine, let's look up Wolverine. Wolverine, for a couple of them, does have a description. So you'll see Wolverine, born with superhuman senses and the power to heal from almost any wound, so on and so forth. So again, super cool data set. I really enjoy working with it. It makes for some neat projects and something that you could show off to other people and say, hey, look, this is really cool. So now you've completed your first end-to-end data engineering project. I hope you're as proud of yourself as I am of you. I hope you're as excited about this data set as I am. Again, it's super cool, neat to play with. I really enjoy it. So go out there, go get your own developer account and go out there and play with it. Tell me below if you enjoy working with the Marvel API once you get a chance to do so, and how you used it. Feel free to share what different visuals you created or what different data sets that you created based on the information you were able to pull. If you have any questions about the video or how to do things, post them down below. I'm Chris Campbell. If you learned something today, be sure to like and subscribe down below. If you want to learn more about SQL, be sure to check out these. If you want to learn more about data engineering concepts, be sure to check out these. And if you want to subscribe, be sure to click this button right here. You've had fun with data.